Well, I think it clearly, that plan diffused the tensions that seem to be brewing in U.S.-China trade relations early in the Trump administration. I think the problem is that it doesn't really address in any significant way the underlying trade imbalance between the two countries. Now, as an economist personally, I don't think that that trade imbalance is very important or a big deal, but politically it is significant. So essentially what we've seen so far is some small market opening concessions, small but significant market opening concessions by China, which are very useful symbolically. But I think the concern that many people have is that once we get past that 100-day deadline, unless there's a little bit more that the Trump administration can point to in terms of wider access for U.S. goods and services, that we could be back in a much more contentious environment. So I think we kind of have to wait and see until the expiration of that 100-day period in July, and then we'll ascertain whether the Trump administration really wants to be aggressive or whether they want to follow up this 100-day deal with similar types of measures to keep the relationship on an even keel. From the U.S. standpoint, the key problem right now is market access. There's a very strong feeling among U.S. businesses and the U.S. government that Chinese companies can go to the U.S. or anywhere in the world and they can buy up any kind of company or asset that they want. But when U.S. companies go to China, they face a lot of restrictions, particularly in service sectors like finance, telecoms, advertising, media, and entertainment, which are the real strengths of the U.S. economy, but are some of the most restricted sectors of the Chinese economy. So from the U.S. perspective, I think that the really critical problem is a perception that there's not adequate market access for U.S. firms in China. I think from the Chinese side, what you usually hear is that there's an excessive politicization of the Chinese investments in the United States, and that they face some restrictions, particularly in high-tech areas where Chinese companies want to acquire. So I think the fundamental issues in the economic relationship do not really relate to the trade in goods, the traditional trade concerns. They relate to the investment climate on both sides. Well, so clearly that particular incident of the American student who returned home in a coma after being imprisoned in North Korea for many months and then died, that causes a big problem, both for U.S.-North Korea relationship and for the relationship between the United States and China in terms of how the North Korean problem is solved. So that's a problem. But just stepping back from that, my personal view is that it was a mistake by the Trump administration to link trade relations with the North Korea problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, most seasoned negotiators in the United States would say that it's important to keep those two baskets separate. They're very different kinds of problems. They require different kinds of solutions. And it's possible to cooperate in one area while having disagreements in the other. So if you link them together, then the risk is that the lack of cooperation or success in one area spills over into the other. So I think that was just like a bad idea to begin with. Second, I think it was also very unrealistic in terms of assuming that the Chinese government is willing or able to do dramatically more to advance the U.S. agenda on North Korea than they have in the past. I think the Chinese government has indicated that it has some flexibility there, but that flexibility is pretty limited. And most professionals who worked on North Korea for a long time recognize that. So I think the other problem here is that it set up, I think, too high an expectation that we would be able to make some breakthrough in North Korea. So right now, I think we're in a state of uncertainty, right? I think it's very clear that the U.S. expectations vis-a-vis Chinese cooperation on North Korea will not be met. And so the question is, when it becomes clear that they are not met, what does the U.S. administration, what is their response? Do they say, oh, well, you didn't do what you were supposed to do in North Korea, therefore we're going to take trade sanctions against you? Or do they take a more pragmatic line? And we just don't know at the moment. Well, I think there's been, in most of the major economic reform areas that were identified at the third plenum of the last Party Congress in 2013, I think you have to say that the progress has been a little bit disappointing. So, for example, there was a lot made at the time of making some pretty major reforms in the state-owned enterprises. Basically, nothing has happened there. And instead of being streamlined, the state-owned enterprises have sort of increased their role in the economy in ways that are probably not helpful for productivity. Fiscal reform was also very important, and that's been very sluggish. And the general feeling, I think, is that the progress towards increasing the market role in most economic decisions has been very slow and very uneven. So it's not a great record. Now, I think partly that reflects the fact that China is a large, very complicated economy, and it's simply hard to do reform. So again, I think there was an expectations were set very high, maybe unrealistically high for what was achievable within a short time frame. To my mind, I think one of the most important things about the upcoming Party Congress and its aftermath is once we have a new set of leadership in the Politburo and the Standing Committee and a further consolidation of power by President Xi, will we see a more concerted and aggressive set of actions on some of these key economic reform initiatives. And some people I think are quite optimistic about that, but I think we have to wait and see. The other thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that when the third plenum reforms were outlined, many of them had a target completion date of 2020. So at the outset, there was clearly an expectation that these things were very difficult. They would take several years to achieve. So the fact that we're in 2017 and not everything has been accomplished is, to some extent, I think within the plan. But we do, I think, need to see a pretty serious acceleration of effort, particularly on state enterprise reform, if China is going to be able to maintain a high rate of productivity growth and economic growth in the coming years. Well, if we look at the structure of China's economic growth over the last several years, the basic problem that we see is that unlike the period before the global financial crisis, when China's growth was supported by extremely high productivity growth and a very rapid growth in the export economy, over the last several years, growth has been supported mainly by an increase in indebtedness, particularly by companies, both state-owned and private, and by the use of state-owned companies to facilitate infrastructure investment, and also by stimulus of the housing market. Right? And none of those things are sustainable. China's investment rate is already, one of the highest in the world. It clearly has to come down. Every measure of capital productivity shows that the return on investment in China has been declining steadily for the last 7 or 8 years, and it's less than half of what it was a decade ago. Measures of productivity suggest that productivity growth in China is about 1/3 what it was before 2008. So China has done quite a good job of sustaining economic growth in a sluggish global environment over the last several years, but they've done it at the cost of piling on more and more debt, making more and more investments that have a very low return, and clearly those processes are not sustainable. So if China wants to have strong, by which I mean at least 5% growth for the next 5 to 10 years, which I think is achievable, it needs to take some measures to improve productivity growth, reduce the reliance on debt, and reduce the reliance on infrastructure and property stimulus. And to do that, there are many different things that you need to accomplish. One of them clearly is reform of the state-owned enterprises so that they are focused in truly strategic industries where they have a comparative advantage. Right now, state enterprises operate in too many sectors at too many levels, so they need to be streamlined. More scope needs to be given to private companies to move into areas which are now, particularly in services, which are restricted to state actors. You need to have further improvements in the financial system, and you also have to have reforms to the fiscal system so that local governments understand that their main job is not to build the next aluminum smelter or steel plant, but to facilitate the growth in consumer spending and services and income growth among households, right? So that's a pretty big agenda. And as I mentioned before, I think this is where we've seen a lot of disappointment over the last 2 or 3 years, that more progress has not been made. So really, I think those are the key things that the government needs to focus on: improving productivity growth, improving the environment for household income growth, reducing the reliance on debt, and reducing the reliance on infrastructure spending.